following sermon was delivered at the 10:30 worship service at the United Methodist Church of Kent. Please enjoy.
This past week, just as our nephew was finishing up a little summer job he was doing for us, painting the shed in our backyard, just as he was finishing, Megan and I noticed that the glass in the window on that shed really needed to be replaced. It's been cracked as long as we've lived here, but mostly we've been able to ignore it. But now with a fresh coat of paint on the walls of the shed, it feels more necessary to fix it than it had. It always amazes me how those little home jobs seem to work that way, how one of them always seems to lead to a few more. We paint the walls in one of our rooms and become more aware of the door. We paint the door and then we need to paint the hallway. We plant in one section of the yard and then there's another calling out for our attention. One job always seems to lead to more. I wonder when I hear Jesus' words today about sitting down and calculating the cost before beginning to build a tower, I wonder if this is a part of what he had in mind. Not just that we need to be aware of the cost of building, but that building will always be an ongoing process. The building isn't done when the tower is constructed. There's always more to do. A little job here, a little cleaning or maintenance there. Perhaps the cost Jesus is talking about isn't just a one-time thing, but it is continual, it is ongoing, and it is daily. Which makes it, I think, an especially appropriate image for the discipleship that Jesus is here describing. This way of life which is following Christ. It is not a one-time thing. We can't just sit down before we are baptized or before we become members of a congregation, before we decide that we're going to join Jesus' difficult and joyful way of living and calculate some set cost. No, as we live day by day with openness to God's grace, day by day with awareness of the Spirit's promptings and listening for God's still speaking voice, we will find ourselves continually growing, continually becoming by grace the image and likeness of Christ. In our Methodist way of speaking, we say that we are going on to perfection. We are always growing into fuller love. Which is one of the reasons, of course, that we participate in classes and Bible studies and small groups of various sorts, not just when we are children or starting out on the journey, but all throughout our whole lives. Our faith is not done growing when we have completed the curriculum of children's Sunday school. There is no graduating out of being a disciple. There's always more to learn, always more to do, more to love. The invitation of God's grace is to such a radically different way of living that there's always more growing for us to do. Today's two readings from the Gospel and from this short little letter we call Philemon are connected in illustrating the depth of this different way of living, by inviting us to consider and to reconsider our understanding and our practice of family. Even our families, even that most seemingly basic and assumed of our social structures, even our families are redefined by God's grace. Whoever comes to me, Jesus says, and doesn't hate father and mother, spouse and children, siblings, and yes, even one's own life, cannot be my disciple, is not participating in this new world we are co-creating. Now, in part, perhaps, Jesus is trying to get our attention here through these harsh-sounding words, but it's more than that, too, I think. I think he is reminding us that this new world God's grace is growing really is a new world, a new way of being that includes our whole lives, our jobs and our identities, ourselves and our families. Not just out around the edges, but at the very root, everything is becoming new. And so consider, Jesus invites us, the ways that we tend to define our families as those who are related to us, or those who are like us, or those who live with us, or those to whom we are somehow legally bound, those whom we choose or find along the way. However it is that we imagine the limits of our kin, those who care for us and those whom we will care for and prioritize, always our imaginations are too narrow. And so Jesus takes our narrow imaginations and he expands them eternally. In God's new world, family is wide open for all of us, our kin, whether we think we are alike or not, whether we like each other or not. Held together by God's grace in a web of mutual care, we are all responsible for the well-being of each and every other. Jesus' invitation is not for us to hate anyone in the sense of doing or wishing them harm, whether parents or spouses or children or siblings or anyone else for that matter. Instead, he is inviting us to stop setting limits, to stop prioritizing some over others, including those who hold those titles in our lives. For through the waters of our baptism, all of our narrow limitations are broken wide open. By God's grace, we are all related, all children of the same loving Spirit, connected by water, which is thicker than blood. And what a blessing that is. What a gracious gift that is when we practice this good news, when we inhabit this larger family. Even when our biological families fail or hurt us, we are part of a broader, more enduring family. Even when we need to detach from the folks who raised us, we are tied into another family, parented by God, who will never fail us, who always loves us, who cares for us unconditionally as we are and as we might become. And even when we fail to love each other well, when we do harm or fall short of helping siblings who have been entrusted into our care, still by grace we are held in a family of forgiveness, a fellowship whose very purpose is healing harm. What a blessing it has been for me personally, and continues to be, to experience and to witness daily the ways that this congregation, this expression locally of church, lives together as family. The ways that you celebrate together and support each other, the meals that you deliver, the cards you send, the phone calls you make, the ways that you serve together and serve each other, the tenderness with which you speak, the generosity with which you listen, the countless times and ways that you show up and stay together on the mountaintops and in the valleys and everywhere in between. What a blessing it is that God's grace knits us together into this bigger, broader, more enduring family. And yet, of course, while it is a blessing, it is not always easy. It is not always easy to belong to each other. As today's other reading shows us, it can be and seem impossible even sometimes to live together as kin. In the letter to Philemon, which we read almost in its entirety this morning, the Apostle Paul challenges Philemon and Onesimus to receive each other as family, something that neither of them wants to do. For prior to this point, Onesimus had been enslaved by Philemon. Imagine that as best you can. Imagine the animosity and the fear that must have existed between these two persons. You can think of all of our many divisions that can seem so deep and persistent in our lives. Maybe you carry around some family grudges or some old resentments. Or you can think about the political and the ideological rivalries that are raging around us all the time. But then imagine the depth of division between Onesimus and Philemon, a person who was held captive and the person who had claimed to own him. Now, let me pause and say that we would prefer, of course, that the earliest Christians, including Paul in this letter, would have directly and explicitly condemned the whole practice of trying to enslave other persons. But tragically, we have to acknowledge they did not. And by not doing so, their silence, provided cover for years, for generations, for millennia of terrible, really horrific harm. It's important that we pause and acknowledge that when we read through our scriptures, that we acknowledge our ancestors' silence in the face of evil, just as we acknowledge our own silence all too often still today. But if we are able, to the extent that we are able, there is value still in hearing what Paul does say in this letter, this radical call, especially to Philemon, to be family. At some point, apparently, Onesimus had escaped from Philemon, and along the way he met Paul and became part of a Christian community. And for Paul, that means that Onesimus and Philemon are kin, irrevocably and unconditionally. They are family. Neither one of them owns the other. In fact, they belong to each other. They are siblings now in this broad new family that God's grace is creating, a family big enough and brave enough to embrace and hold us all. And so Paul works then through this letter to bring them together, to help them realize the truth of their kinship. First, he appeals to everything that binds Philemon to Paul, reminding him that they are partners in the faith. Then he appeals to everything that binds Onesimus to Paul, referring to Onesimus as my child and my own heart. In fact, Paul says he would love to keep Onesimus with him, but he knows the health of the whole family is more important than his personal preference. And so while reconciliation will be costly, while healing the harm will be both hard and difficult, Paul places himself as the link between these two. He will bear the cost so that these two can come together as kin. It is undoubtedly a hard call that Paul issues here to Onesimus and to Philemon. It is risky for each of them in different ways. And so, Paul appeals also to others in the family to support them as they heal. Note the greeting at the beginning of this letter. Paul does not send this as a private letter to Philemon, but to the church who meets together in Philemon's house. It's a message to be read and worked through together by the whole family. For any division in any part of Christ's family affects the entire household, and so they are all invited into the work of reconciliation together. And then finally, Paul ends the letter by telling Philemon to prepare a guest room. I love this little detail. When Paul is released from prison, he says he will come back to check on how this family is working things out. Are they behaving as family, caring for, receiving one another as kin? Or have they fallen back into their old divisions? Again, certainly as a policy statement on the practice of enslavement, this letter falls far short of what we need. But as one specific, concrete, and practical example of bringing God's new world to earth, God's grace into the messiness of daily family life, this letter remains, I think, both hopeful and challenging, inviting each of us to consider our belonging to each other. What about you? Each of us is asked this morning. Whom is God calling you to love? And what will that love require? How is God inviting me to change, to grow, to expand, to reprioritize my attachments in the direction of God's dream? What resentments am I holding on to that need to be released? And what relationships do I need to try to mend? All the way back at the beginning of our scriptures, in the very first relationship between siblings, we hear this question that is wondered aloud: am I my sibling's keeper? And all throughout the rest of our scripture stories, the response keeps coming back the same. Yes. Yes. Unambiguously, yes. And also, everyone is my sibling. We are all of us family, all called to hold each other in a community of tender care, each accountable for each other, whether we think we're related or not, because we are each each by grace, God's beloved child. Thanks be to God. Amen.
Thank you for listening to this edition of the United Methodist Church of Kent Sermon Podcast. For more information about the church, visit www.kentmethodist.org.